Hello and welcome to the Print Softcover, today, where we launch select non-fiction books. Today we have with us James Staples. Staples is a professor of anthropology at the Brunel University, UK. And we're here today to talk about his latest book, Sacred Cows and Chicken Manchurian, The Everyday Politics of Eating Meat in India. Great cover, vibrant, red. So in his own words from the Brunel website, it explores how beef-eating Christians, Muslims, and Dalits in South India are experiencing the state's clampdown on cattle slaughter alongside vigilante attacks from cow protectionists. Welcome, Professor, to the Print.
Thank you.
Before we get to the meat of the book, I wanted to ask you about the publishing process. Because I recently attended a launch of another book, which was about Muslim food in South Asia, where the publisher sort of made an offhanded remark about how the publishing process took a little while because they were unsure of what words they could and could not use and whether that would affect sales or not. So I was curious whether that was something that applied to you, and especially because I noted a peer getting publishing in the US and publishing in India.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I published it, first in the US through Washington University Press. And then they made an arrangement with HarperCollins to bring out an Indian imprint, which I was very pleased about because it makes it affordable in India. Yeah. It's, I think, 400p instead of £20 or $40 or whatever it is in the States, which makes it very expensive in India. So it was good. Yeah, it was good that it was affordable. I'm trying to think. There weren't really many issues. I know that they read. I mean, the version that had been printed in the States went through another round of copy editing with the pub in India, and they only asked me to qualify a few things to check. I mean, there were links to websites and things that they wanted me to update, but also really to sure that I had the data to back up certain claims that I was making, which they were worried that might be taken as being critical, which may not have worried the US publishers in quite the same way. But it was actually, it was very straightforward. It was very quick, and the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you shows that they've also done quite a good job of trying to do some marketing around the book, which hopefully is a good thing. And
it's a great book. And another thing before we get to the book is why chicken Manchurian? Why specifically that dish?
I mean, it could have been others. I mean, I think I chose it in part because I wanted to show the food was coming in from other places, in a very short phrase. I mean, I could have chosen, I don't know, there are chicken lollipops and chicken popcorn, I think, that you could buy from a kind of Kentucky Fried Chicken style restaurant in the local town where I worked, which came up. But I think when I went to India first, which was to the part of India where I did most of my research, I first went there back in the early 1980s. And I mean, at that time, you really couldn't get, even chapatis were seen as very exotic. They were a northern Indian food that you really only had rice and dals and various vegetables and so on. And it was only later that these carts selling Chinese style food or Manchurian style food, as they called it, sprung up in the local bazaar. And there were a couple of restaurants which started selling it. So I think chicken Manchurian was one of these things that was seen by local people as slightly exotic, or young people who were students and things might eat that their parents wouldn't eat. They'd eat stir-fried noodles in the street before going home after classes and so on. So it spoke to a new kind of, I suppose, cosmopolitanism, but one which wasn't exclusively middle or upper middle class in the way that I think other kind of cosmopolitan foods perhaps were. I suppose I could have referenced pizzas or burgers, but because it was about the politics of meat as well, I thought it should be something that was meat related.
Yeah. And I think you chose well. And I feel like chicken Manchurian is one of those dishes that a lot of us urban English speaking, sure, but a lot of rural India don't realize doesn't come from India. It feels very Indian in a way.
It does, yeah. Yeah, except for that very bright orange sauce that it always seemed to be served in.
What was interesting about the book in your research is how it explores the anxieties of those living in the middle of the spectrum, not, the Gaurakshaks or the cow protectioners, or not the ones who are organizing these pro-beef eating festivals in colleges, but people who fall in the middle of the spectrum, whose everyday lives have to do with meat or meat eating. Why did you choose to concentrate on that particular space?
I think in part because these were the people that I was already working with. So I was, as an anthropologist, I kind of try to follow what it is that they're interested in or what they're talking about, rather than necessarily come in with a preconceived question or an idea of what I want to do. But it also seemed to me that in lots of the news reports, and journalism was doing a great job of covering a lot of the controversies that there were around eating and not eating beef. But it was presented as a very polarized kind of picture, that you had, the pro-beef activists who were Dalits, but mainly Dalits who were in universities, who were educated, who were organizing particular kinds of protests. And then you had these vigilantes on the other side, but who didn't make up, I guess, mainstream, everyday Hindus, if that's the right word, or people in everyday life. So I suppose I was trying to bring in a different perspective, to bring some nuance into the debate, which I think is probably needed. I mean, I think lots of the discussion on social media, about all sorts of things, not just this topic, tends to become very quickly very polarized, that you're either very much for something or you're very much against it. And I think that isn't necessarily the case, that there was a lot of ambivalence about, people who sometimes ate beef, sometimes didn't, who ate it but didn't quite approve of it, or who approved and were quite happy for other people to eat it but would never consider eating it themselves. So you had a whole spectrum of people doing different things and thinking different things, which weren't really covered in those polarized kind of debates that you got in the press.
And speaking about more nuances, I think an interesting nuance that you bring out is the difference between cow meat and buffalo meat, and how that's perceived in different communities. And the most, I think, tangible aspect of that, to me at least, when reading the book, was the images of cattle they use on these butcher shops and how they're so ambiguous. Was this idea of cow versus buffalo meat a surprising discovery to you?
Well, I hadn't really thought about it before in that way, because people tended just to call it beef. And I think that often it was called beef in a way to fudge the boundaries between the two, even though people weren't necessarily consciously doing that. But when I pin people down, as it were, and ask them, which type is it you eat, and you had people who would say, well, I only eat cow meat, or I only eat buffalo meat. Often Muslims would say that they only eat cow meat, that they didn't want to eat buffalo because, I suppose, because buffalo was associated with Dalits, with low casteness, with untouchability, and so on. And yet often Dalit caste people I spoke to, particularly Madigas in Andhra Pradesh, who worked with leather, would often talk to me about buffalo meat being particularly good for their constitutions, but they also considered the cow in some ways to be sacred. And yet both groups were buying meat from the same butcher shops, from the same places. The meat wasn't labeled as one or the other. Usually, people would go to the market and either buy a cow that had been slaughtered or, buy pieces. So it wasn't always quite clear which one was which, even though people were very adamant often that they could tell the difference between the two.
That's also very interesting to me. Just maybe this would be interesting for you as well. I think the distinction between beef and buffalo came into focus for me when there was the ban on beef, and buff, as we call it, sort of became more popular. And I'm from Kerala, a state where beef is not banned. But when I go back home, the beef we eat is buffalo most of the time, which my family says is a better meat. But every time I go back to Kerala, people say, oh yeah, bring back, some beef for us. But 90% of the time, it's what you get in Delhi anyway.
Right, yeah.
So this idea
Yeah.
of buffalo and cow is very fascinating to me, and you've explored
Mm.
it in such an interesting, visceral way. Um, and another thing where you talk about, there's a quote in the book that in order to survive, a religious doctrine or a cultural practice also had to make rational and economic sense. How does that play in terms of beef trade and how the trade has evolved over time?
I mean, I think, for example, the fact that beef was always the cheapest kind of meat that you could get, which meant, on the one hand, that it was low status, but it meant that people that couldn't afford meat otherwise could afford potentially to eat beef, which is why it was eaten very widely in the village where I did my initial field work. And when it was eaten less, it was not so much because people had gone off beef or they didn't want to eat it anymore. It was because chicken had become so cheap. So you have these other kinds of outside influences. You have, the growth, as it were, of the broiler chicken. These big chicken farms, chickens which can be, from hatching out of an egg to making it to the table takes only 6 weeks now, whereas it used to take 6 months for the kind of country birds which they used to eat. And although people, when I spoke to them, much preferred those country birds because they were chewier, they tasted, as they said, how chicken ought to taste, and these other things were a bit rubbery, a bit tasteless. They were very cheap, so it meant you could eat meat. You could eat chicken every Sunday, for example, in the case of the people I worked with. And at certain times of the year, it was cheaper than beef. So people switched fairly easily over to chicken in those contexts. And I think people would also, serve chicken at weddings, for example, because it meant you could serve everybody who ate meat in ways that you couldn't do otherwise. So I suppose that was part of it. I mean, part of it, I suppose, were issues around respectability. Chicken was seen as a more respectable meat. But then at the same time, you also had, older people who I knew who had never eaten beef in the past, who were then told by their doctors that they were anemic, that beef was what they needed to eat, that they would eat it, or they had, son-in-laws or daughter-in-laws who came from families that had eaten beef and wanted to serve it to the family. So there were kind of inter-family dynamics going on, but there was also this broader sphere of, which was partly ecological. It was about what was available, something like goat meat, which used to be eaten much more when I was first there in the 1980s, perhaps into the early 1990s, had now become so expensive. And it had become so expensive in part because there was not really any grazing land to rear goats on easily. So goat was really expensive. So people didn't eat goat mutton hardly at all anymore. And chicken, sometimes prawns or fish, when people came into the village selling them. But chicken in particular had become the default kind of meat rather than beef, I think, not because of any religious reasons or because of the other wider political controversies about it, but simply because chicken was cheap. So if the BJP wants to stop people eating beef, the easiest way is to make chicken cheap, I guess. Yeah.
Hot tip.
Or tasty. Yeah.
On the opposite end of that spectrum of people moving, actually quite similar to when you think about it, people moving from beef to non-beef meats. You speak about the transition of beef in Hinduism itself, how when in scriptures like the Manusmriti, beef eating was encouraged, not even accepted, but rather encouraged. And then it goes into this central tenet of Hinduism to not eat beef. Can you describe a little bit of what that journey is and how that came about?
Yeah, I can try. And the detail of it is in the book. But I think a lot of interpretations of the Vedic texts were often about protection of the cow because they were economically valuable, and they were economically valuable to Brahmins in particular, who tended to own them, for milk and for dairy, but also potentially for meat as well. And there is an idea which is explored, in some of the historical work about the development of Hinduism, that beef became something that Brahmins stopped eating in relation to Jains and Buddhists not eating beef. In a way, it was getting that upper hand. We will no longer sacrifice the cow and will no longer eat it either, and therefore we can claim higher levels of purity. And it seems that it was about that time that beef became increasingly taboo as something to eat for Brahmins, certainly, and for Hindus. There are mixed kind of messages, I think, throughout the Vedas and throughout the subsequent texts and throughout the historical documents that you read. But it was always ambiguous, I think, in certain ways, but never as clear cut as it's often presented as being. I think in the current political context, it's often presented as being, the Vedas banned beef, and therefore this is something that we should return to, that the British, during British colonialism, or the Mughal Empire has damaged this, and we should return to this old way of doing things. And I think the message probably in the Vedas and in those later texts is, again, much more nuanced than that.
And just speaking more about caste and the eating of beef, a fascinating idea was that of they kill, we eat. And it especially underlines this sort of subversion of caste of the meat-eating Brahmin, who somehow still keeps his caste purity because he's not the one doing the killing. What was that like when you encountered that sort of contradiction?
Yeah, it was an interesting contradiction. And in a way, when I thought about it, it wasn't so different to, for example, people I encounter here in the UK who eat meat, who might eat all kinds of meat, but wouldn't want to witness the slaughter of the animal and don't want to think about the animal that has been killed, and who might not eat fish because they can see the head, for example, and it's kind of looking at you, or but would happily eat, I don't know, a frozen lasagna which contains beef meat because it seems in some ways so far removed from the animal. And those people also know that this animal has obviously been killed, but you can somehow bracket this and not think about it, which I think was also the way for lots of the beef eaters in the community that I worked with would say, well, they kill it, we eat it, what else are we supposed to eat? There was a kind of and I hadn't expected that much acceptance in a way of the idea that we shouldn't kill other animals. People seem to be quite readily accepting of that idea, of that principle. But somebody had killed them, so therefore we will eat them. And if it's killed, we should eat it because it tastes good, and so on and so on. There was also, I think, the point with there was also, I think, a tension between people who would rear cattle, which were reared for milk and for all of those things, these dairy products, which are really valorized, I think, by the higher castes.
Yeah.
And where meat, in a way, is the beef is actually a byproduct of that industry, of the dairy industry, which is another kind of contradiction there. If you didn't have the dairy, you wouldn't have as many cattle, you wouldn't have beef being eaten, particularly because in India, I think, unlike in the UK and unlike in the States and other places, most of the cattle that's slaughtered for consumption are quite old animals. They're animals that have often been dairy in the past, or they've been working animals and are at the end of their lives anyway. So, for many people, they're a kind of byproduct, a natural byproduct of the dairy industry.
And speaking of this slaughtering of old cattle, you speak about how those who rear cattle at home, whether they are those of the higher end of the spectrum, of the caste spectrum, or the Gaurakshak, or whether they are, the Madigas who are, still rearing cattle at home for dairy, for ghee, whatever else they give. They see their cattle in the same way. They see them as pets, and how selling the cattle becomes this sort of unseen transaction of, I don't know what's going to happen with it. What was that like? Did you ever sort of probe and be like, okay, but it's being sold for meat, right?
Yeah. I guess I kind of implied that to people, and I don't think it was that necessarily that people were necessarily lying or trying to mask the truth. I think it was genuinely a kind of strategic ignorance where we don't try and think about those things, in the same way that people might eat frozen lasagna but try not to think about where this thing has actually come from or what really might be in it. And in fact, that probably goes for lots of the things that we eat, and that would disturb us if we really knew what were in a lot of particularly the processed kind of foods that we eat. And I think people were used to having cattle of a certain age. They no longer gave milk. There were a set of people who were known to you who would be brokers in the local town. You would call on them. They were the people who would then go off and sell your cattle, and they would bring the money back to you. And you didn't see anything that went on really behind that point. And that seemed to be less so. I mean, some of the Madigas I spoke to who reared buffalo in particular told me that they wouldn't ever eat their own buffalo, and they'd actually keep them until they died if they could, and so on. And yet would obviously eat the buffalo of somebody else. So again, there were odd tensions there. But people talked about that in relation to chickens as well, that they would not necessarily eat the chicken that they had reared at home, but they would buy a chicken from their neighbors, or they would swap them. So you're not eating this thing which somehow has a kinship tie to you, I guess.
You spoke about how, these brokers come and then the people who are selling it don't see what's going on. But you went into some of these markets. What was it like? Noisy, smelly?
Yeah, pretty noisy. Yeah. I mean, they were in big kind of open spaces mostly. And there were people, there were lots of cattle, being taken off vans and being led in small herds by different people. So yeah, lots of people, lots of animals. It felt very chaotic, and I'm sure it wasn't actually. It was very organized way. I mean, the people that we went with who were butchers, or they sold meat from a shop, from a market, and they separated us from us pretty quickly. They didn't want to be with us while they were there, and I don't know whether that was because they didn't want us to see their operation, or they felt that we would be a hindrance. Having this strange white man with them would. It looked suspicious, and might have worried people at a time when tensions were already quite high. So yeah, people went off. They looked at the cows that were around. They bought them, and yeah, they were herded up, or they were, they'd arrange for a lorry to take them back, either to the slaughterhouse or somewhere else where they were going to keep them before they were slaughtered. I mean, most of the butchers and most of the market people that I worked with were quite small scale, so they'd be looking to buy one or two animals, and some of the smaller scale ones would go directly to the slaughterhouse and buy meat from somebody who'd already bought a cow there and had it slaughtered. But it seemed to be that rather than farms with really large numbers of cattle all getting slaughtered at once and then sending them off to different places, although I'm assuming that also happened to some extent.
When we talk about beef, you say meat, the idea that beef is not treated the same way in India as it is in Western countries, where there's the filet mignon, there's the prime rib, there's prized cuts of beef. But in India, it's just chopped into blocks and given off as meat. Was that an interesting concept to you? And personally, I've always been curious about why that plays out in India. Did you maybe find an answer?
Yeah, no, I don't really know if I find a definitive answer. I mean, I think partly because they're older animals, so there aren't the same kinds of prime cuts that perhaps you would get for a cow that has been reared specifically for beef, which you might get, in Europe, for example, and which has been, grass-fed or fed on particular things, which these cattle obviously haven't, and they've mostly been for dairy and they've been worked. I mean, the only kinds of distinctions you really got were for the kind of organ pieces. So somebody might say, if they knew I was going to the market, they'd say, oh, well, if you're early, you might be able to get the kidneys or the liver or something like that, or the brains even, which were sometimes sold. So people might ask me to get those things, but otherwise the meat seemed to be cut, very generically chopped up. I mean, maybe it was in part because you already had that ambiguity over whether it was a cow or whether it was a buffalo, whether it was a male animal or a female animal. But yes, it was just generic meat. And I suppose the ways of cooking it, because they were old animals anyway, involved often pressure cooking or cooking it for a long time. Rather than a flash fry steak that you might get in the United States or something. Perhaps they just didn't have those prime cuts in those animals.
Just going back to the cutting of the meat, you describe a scene where, you're going with one of your informants and you're going into this field where you're still not sure if they're going to cut a cow or not, if you're just being taken for a ride. Yeah. But apart from the actual cutting of the meat, what was interesting is that there was a police station nearby. And how that sort of this legality, this watchful eye of the police, they're looking and they're also coming to eat the meat, but it's illegal to slaughter cows. How does that work, and what did you observe among the interaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think in that area, it was a very Muslim area, and most of the police officers in that station were also Muslim, from what I can gather. So it was kind of overlooked, and I guess that this piece of wasteland, the people who were doing the slaughter and selling the meat from there were probably paying something. They didn't say that they were, but I imagine they were probably paying something, whether in meat or in money, to the police in that case. So there were, I guess it was embedded in relationships locally, and I'm sure that they had to be discreet, and that the police would expect them to be discreet. And if they were discreet and nobody was causing trouble, they were getting some sort of some kind of benefit from it, then for them it wasn't an issue in that particular area. I mean, I felt quite nervous. I wasn't really quite sure whether I should be there. When I was in the auto, people had elaborate. If somebody stops us and we're driving out in an auto at 4 a.m, and we've got this white foreigner with us, what can we say? And I mean, there were kind of ethical issues for me about, was I putting them at risk by being there? And we had some elaborate story. We were to say that we were going to the hospital to visit somebody or other. I can't quite remember what the story was. But we went there, and it got light as you saw that we arrived as the slaughter had just happened, I think. And the animal was cut up into portions. It was sold. There was a kind of rhythm to it, which didn't feel, I mean, I don't eat meat myself. So I also had mixed feelings about, did I really want to be seeing this? But, it was something that was happening. It seemed to be an important part of the story. So I felt that I should. And somehow to me, and obviously I'm not the animal being slaughtered, so I can't speak for what the cow felt about it, but it didn't feel as horrific as somehow I'd imagined that it might do. You could, almost imagine classical music playing in the background. It was very quiet and seemed to be done quite respectfully. Again, you don't know how these things might have been done, if you weren't there, but it was done very quickly, very respectfully. It was quiet, calm. I mean, the animal was dissected enormously quickly, and the transformation from it being a live animal to being chunks of meat spread out on the outer skin of the meat somewhere else was so quick. It was astounding, I think, actually.
And you spoke, especially in this anecdote, about how, as a especially white researcher, inserting yourself into these people's lives can be interesting, sometimes ethically ambiguous. What was that challenge like? I know you've mentioned that you've been associated with this particular community from the 80s. So have they become accustomed to you, or is it still awkward?
It's not awkward in that sense. And they're very accustomed to me in that particular community. Obviously, I meet people in other contexts all the time as well. I think it's important as an anthropologist, wherever you're from, but always to be aware of the kind of power relations in which you're embedded. And I was never really seen as an equal. I was always a foreigner coming from outside. I was always perceived of as being rich. And because I was perceived of as being rich, as somebody who could potentially help them in certain ways, whether, that's getting links to getting visas to go to other places or getting other jobs, or, perhaps supporting financially particular projects and so on. And I think that never goes away. I think what did happen, particularly in the village, and people said this when I'd be chatting to them, from when I was doing my PhD field work. Well, we can disguise things for a certain amount of time, but you're here for a year. You're here. You're in our houses. We can't keep it up for this long. So you do see everything, but we trust you to give a complete picture. And then, even if there's bad stuff in there, there's kind of enough good stuff to counteract it. Seemed to be the message that people gave. And I think for this particular kind of story about beef and the politics of meat, which, although it evolved not organically in a way for me. So it wasn't that I made a decision that I would go out and write a book about beef politics.
Yeah.
It emerged through the work I was doing and through the things that people were telling me. But it seemed to me that if you had journalists who were in India who obviously had much more potentially to use by publishing these kinds of stories, that in a way it would be cowardly of me not to publish those stories. That having the privilege of being an outsider, who, although I would love to come back to India, I'm not compelled to live in India and face the consequences necessarily in quite the same way as people who within India who are writing other books and publishing other things about this stuff, who show, I think, a lot more bravery sometimes in doing that in the current context.
I know through the book that you're a vegan. So how is, the politics of vegetarianism is very different abroad, and especially even the politics of just eating meat is very different from politics of vegetarianism and eating meat in India, where here eating meat is seen as resistance and vegetarianism is seen as oppression, whereas probably in the West, it's more the other way around. What was that like navigating, especially as a vegan, and especially, like you mentioned earlier in the book, sort of denying eating beef from the people who served it to you and not being seen as an ally? Yeah.
It was through being a vegetarian that the book came about in the first place, because it exposed me to those kinds of conversations and those kinds of reactions, which, as you say, kind of surprised me as somebody who was a vegetarian in the West, which is seen as perhaps a moral position, but it's certainly not associated, with the far right, for example, generally, I don't think. And it's seen as a personal choice, whereas obviously in India, it might be something that you're born into, so you can be a vegetarian and still sometimes eat meat potentially because you're a vegetarian by caste, and so on and so on. But yes, so I did have that. I suppose there was that kind of ethnographic moment of going to somebody's house who I'd told that I was vegetarian, which I was at the time, that I would eat anything else they gave me, and that they tried to give me some beef, and then had that moment of offense when I said, no, I don't eat this. And that she said, or I don't know if she said it directly, but there was certainly that sense from conversations that we later had that would have identified me as being an ally, that she was somebody from a Dalit caste. She ate beef as a celebration, both of her caste status, but also of the fact that she was a Christian. So for her, it wasn't a marker of being low, of being lowly, of being impure, and so on. She had kind of inverted that to make it very much a symbol of a positive symbol of being a Dalit. This was something that you could eat. And she kind of teased, she'd say these things about these Hindus, they don't know what they're missing, that they can't eat this delicious food. Aha, was the kind of message she gave. So it was uncomfortable very often, and it was in some ways difficult to navigate that. And it was in some ways, actually, in writing the book, I became a vegan, I guess, as I was doing this research. I'd been a vegetarian before. But I think as I was alerted to that tension between, on the one hand, if I ate dairy, if I ate eggs and so on, which, vegetarians in the West do. I know that vegetarians in India don't always eat eggs. but by eating those things, the beef was actually a natural byproduct of this. And in some ways, it seemed to me then not to make sense, not to carry on drinking milk and these other things, and not to eat beef. So I had a kind of moment of, should I perhaps, while I'm here, eat beef, or should I go the other way? So I tried out the other way, and that was how I ended up becoming vegan. Sometimes when I'm in India too, if people give me a cup of tea and it's already got the milk in, I will drink it because it seems to be a waste otherwise. And often I'll know the cow that it's come from, so that feels slightly different somehow. But yeah, there are those tensions that are there all the time. But they're tensions which have been useful actually, and which have been quite productive in enabling me to do the research, and which open up conversations that I otherwise might not have had with some of those people.
What are these interesting conversations that maybe you can recall? Maybe not just about being vegan and navigating a book about meat eating, but generally, what conversation do you think surprised you the most while researching this book?
I think, that's a good question. One of the things I think was when I was speaking to people who I knew to always have eaten beef, and then I expected them to talk about it in this celebratory way, who then weren't, who said, well, who did the well, they kill, we eat kind of responses. We know we shouldn't really eat it. Nobody should eat meat. But, if you're going to eat meat at all, you may as well eat beef. Why is it worse to kill a cow than to kill a chicken? Or if you have a prawn curry, you've taken the lives of, 50 prawns or whatever. If you eat beef, you've taken, one cow has died and it's fed lots and lots of people. So philosophically, which is worse. So people did think about those things and had some of those conversations. I think one of the other things that surprised me perhaps a bit, because it was something that emerged over a long period of doing research. So, the conversation initially, which triggered it with the woman who tried to offer me a beef curry, which I rejected, I think was probably about 25 years ago now. I think this was when I was, perhaps even longer ago, when I was doing my PhD field work. So I think I expected a continuity when I came back and I started doing research that was specifically for this book. And that wasn't what I found happening, that there were changes, particularly changes which seemed to go with the ebbs and flows of the political cycle. So when the Congress was back in power, so it had been the BJP, and then Congress was back in power, and the eating meat had less symbolic value at that point, I think, or eating beef had less symbolic value. So it didn't matter so much. There wasn't so much at stake. People didn't talk about it so much. It became less of a celebratory thing. And then that turned again. But some of the original people who were the most adamant about eating beef now would say, oh, no, I don't eat it anymore because I've got high BP and I've got sugar, and I'm now on a vegetarian diet, and that's better for me. And I felt almost disappointed at this point. I was there ready to fly the flag for them, as it were. So I think, again, that speaks to those kind of ambiguities that we were talking about at the beginning, that people aren't one thing necessarily all the time. So it's not even that you're either for or against, but that, over the course of your life cycle, those things also change and develop and swap around, that they're not fixed, which again, I think we're often prone to see them as being.
I think that's a great way to end. We've sort of come full circle. Thank you so much for talking to us at ThePrint, and thank you for writing this wonderful book. I have literally highlighted portions as I've been reading.
Well, thank you for reading it, and thank you for having me. It's been great.
And this is Theres from ThePrint, signing off with Professor James Staples. Thank you.